In the distant future, there is space travel and also fetishization of those space travelers. I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a short story because it is Short Story Tuesday. It is also Black History Month, so I will be talking about a black writer. And today's short story is all about space travel and the sexuality associated with that. I am referring to I and Gomorrah by Samuel R. Delany, which was published in 1967 in the short story collection Dangerous Visions, which was actually edited by Harlan Ellison, and this short story has won a Nebula Award. I think it's interesting that Harlan Ellison, who I've talked about on this channel before, and Samuel Delany have a connection, but it seems like both of them kind of have controversial beliefs, and so there's a similarity between them in that. But for those who don't know, Samuel Delany is a Black American science fiction writer primarily. He's written a number of books and a number of short stories, been featured in many collections. And he's primarily known for science fiction, as I said before, and he's won awards for that, which is significant because historically, black writers have been sort of non-published or excluded from the literary world, but that's probably more evident in science fiction, where black writers have been sort of marginalized even further. So it's interesting to find a black writer who is considered a big name in the field. And it should also be noted that Samuel Delany is either gay or bisexual, which is important because that frequently shows up in his work. He writes not only about the future, technology, science fiction, space travel, but it also seems that he writes about taboo sex topics, especially of their time, which may have something to do with his identity as a gay man. And a lot of people have sort of called out his work for being too sexual, talking about too many taboo topics like incest, whereas others have said that he's willing to sort of like cross the line when necessary in order to talk about things that people typically like push away and don't want to focus on. I'd be very interested in exploring more of his work based on what I've heard about it. So you might see me read one of his books. Now, it is unfortunate because I've also read that he supports NAMBLA, which is the North American Man-Boy Love Association, which is not good. That's basically pedophilia. That people might have different terms for that, but that's what that is. It's not good. So even though this author is somewhat celebrated, they do have weird beliefs, and we should acknowledge that. And without further ado, let's talk about I and Gomorrah. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So I and Gomorrah focuses on an unnamed spacer, which I believe is just a term for people who go to space and do various things on different planets, kind of like astronauts of the far future. And at the beginning of the story, this spacer and their fellow spacers, their co-workers, I think are on shore leave on Earth. They're coming back to Earth. They're sort of like coming to Earth on their rocket and going to different cities. They're specifically looking for Frelks. They arrive in Paris and also Houston, and they don't seem to find these Frelks, who, at least at the beginning of the story, we don't really know what they are. And then they also arrive in Istanbul, where they think they will have much more luck there. And the other spacers go off, and they all sort of travel on their own for a little bit. And it's at this point that the narrator, the unnamed spacer, arrives upon a poor art student who seems to have an attraction to the spacer. This art student says they don't have any money, which suggests that there's a prostitution that sort of occurs here. And we learn that this woman is a frelk among many other people. And what a frelk is a person who has an attraction to the spacer because the spacer has been neutered at a young age in order to allow them to engage in space travel, because the rockets aren't properly shielded. They could like your gonads or something like that will become irradiated and cause problems. And maybe also a number of other problems of having children in space or something like that. But there are people who are attracted to the sort of gender non-conforming or androgynous sort of nature of these spacers, and this art student is in fact one of them. And so the spacer goes to the art student's home. There's a discussion of this sexuality, a discussion of the spacer's condition. The art student, a woman named Yuri, says that she loves the spacer. It seems to be something greater than a normal prostitution type encounter, which is what the spacer is used to. However, the spacer chooses to reject Yuri's love, and primarily because of her lack of money, and primarily because she doesn't want, or the spacer doesn't want the other women or the other people in the house who live with this poor art student to become involved in a sort of prostitution type thing, which would be pretty strange for the spacer, presumably. But at this point, Yuri tells the spacer that there is a certain bar where spacers hang out, although the spacer says that it is a place where frolks hang out, and they don't want to be sort of objectified in that way. But the spacer decides to go to this bar where they encounter their friends, their coworkers, the other spacers. Those spacers seem to have had better luck in finding frelks, but we see that our spacer has not had such luck, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with this story. I thought it was pretty bizarre. I was not expecting this from a science fiction story, but ultimately I think I love this story. I think it's pretty good in terms of what Delany is really talking about here. And the main theme of the story seems to be fetishization, a word that is very hard to say and which I butchered in my introduction, but it seems that certain people are attracted to the spacer's condition. They were neutered during prior to puberty, so when they were to experience puberty, they don't really have that sense of sexual attraction anymore. And there are people who say, like, are you a man or are you a woman? People don't really know the gender of the spacers most of the time. What this has sort of done, this sort of condition of the spacer, is it's created a sexual prostitution economy of sorts. So the spacers can head to Earth, make a little money while they're on vacation, while they're on shore leave or something like that, and these frelks can get their rocks off. They can engage in their fetish, but it's clear maybe they don't necessarily see the spacers as human. They see them as something else that will allow them to engage in their sexual thrill. What Yuri notes in this story is that it seems to be more than merely sexual. There seems to be a little bit of love on Yuri's part, because of how she feels when she sees the spacer and when she's with the spacer. Even though the spacer just thinks it's a prostitutional bargain there, Yuri argues that there's something deeper here. Allow me to read you the quote from this. I want you because you can't want me. That's the pleasure. If someone really had a sexual reaction to us, we'd be scared away. I wonder how many people there were before there were you, waiting for your creation. We're necrophiles. I'm sure grave robbing has fallen off since you started going up, but you don't understand. She paused. If you did, then I wouldn't be scuffing leaves now and trying to think from whom I could borrow 60 lira, which is an interesting quote from this. Essentially, Yuri is just saying, there were people who wanted this before, and they robbed graveyards, they had sex with dead people, but now they don't need to do that anymore. They're afraid of being wanted by other people, and so because the spacer can't really want people, because the spacer is just an object to them. Like they can feel comfortable and engaging in their sexual interaction, knowing they probably won't be abused or something like that. They probably won't be manipulated by someone who maybe can't feel that in the same way. There is a question of whether the spacer is even able to connect, and I do think they are. I do think they feel a pang of anger, frustration for being used in this way, but they're still participating in it because maybe it's the only way that they can feel human connection. They're certainly not getting it from their fellow spacers, and the other people on Earth just view them as oddities. So all that's left are these Frelks who are willing to love them, even if it necessarily isn't a real sense of love. And so this brings up a great question. I think what Delany is trying to get us to consider is, how do you cope with merely being a fetish? How do you cope with sort of being an object in society, not really considered a human being, not really considered an equal to these people? You're not even on Earth, you're in space, and you only show up on Earth on your shore leave, and when you do, people consider you an object, and they pay you to have sex with them. It certainly would be hard, and I don't think there would be coping. If these people were on Earth any longer, it might create additional difficulties, but thank goodness they get to leave after their shore leave finishes. And it's also important to consider that Delany is a gay man. At the time, would the perceptions of gay men have affected how he wrote this story? There is more to talk about, which I'll talk about later. But I think that's really important. It's also important to note that Stonewall, the riot, what took place essentially between the LGBT community and the police, and I believe New York or something like that. That was part of the gay sort of experience. It was sort of a reaction to, you're not treating us like human beings, and some people in the community fetishize gay people, lesbian people, and so maybe some of that's coming off in the story here, and this also has troubling implications, because she's saying we were grave robbers before, so these people are sort of evolving with the times. But what does it say? That a lot of people are sort of obsessed or fascinated by these people who weren't allowed to go through puberty, who have a sort of childlike understanding of sex and all of that. Are those people real? Do they exist? And if they do, that's obviously not ideal. It creates a sort of wonder, in the future, will you have people like these, and will they be treated like human, like they're human, or will these people who fetishize these space travelers exist, or do they even exist now? And I do think that they exist now, and it says a lot about how sex isn't necessarily equal. There's not a lot of equity in sex. A lot of people aren't on equal footing because one side fetishizes another. There's a lot more to talk about as it pertains to that, I think. Another important aspect of this story is sexual promiscuity and the rejection of gender norms. There's this idea that space and future development requires new values, and this was kind of happening in the 1960s. You saw the sexual revolution, Stonewall, as I mentioned before, being a riot, the sort of free love movement mixed with the sort of LGBT community sort of getting out there again after the 50s, 40s sort of kind of pushed them into a sort of circle, and resulted in many anti-LGBT laws in the country. And maybe this is Delany saying, these current laws, these current requirements, these ordinances and whatnot, are very restrictive. And in order for society to move forward, we need to become more welcoming of this. We need to consider new gender norms. We need to consider new sort of thoughts on sexuality and the acceptance of, romantic ideals, various romantic ideals, gay, lesbian, transgender, all sorts of things like that. Whereas, civilizations, cultures, society cannot advance if we are stuck in our puritanical past. I think he even says explicitly that in the story. And it's also important to note the transgender nature of spacers, because they go to Paris and then they go to Houston, and both cultures, they stumble into people who are like, ooh, you could be a woman, ooh, you could be a man, and I might be attracted to you in some sort of way. So the spacers aren't specifically male or female. There's something more at play, even though they were probably born male, as the spacer in this story was, because their bodies did not undergo like puberty in the normal sense. There's an androgynous nature to them, and this is where society has sort of marched forward, and because society has sort of accepted that this is the way that things have to be, space travel was allowed to develop. And of course, it's created this prostitutional economy, but society was still allowed to advance because we changed our puritanical ways. We changed our perspectives on sex. One of the last things I'll note is the vague fascism that sort of exists with all of this. I did say that society was allowed to advance, the government sort of changed its perspectives, but that didn't change the fact that the government was a little fascist. Rather than controlling sex, now the government, it still controls sex. It neuters these spacers. It neuters, young people who they think are going to go travel into space, and those people aren't allowed to develop as they would normally develop. And so the government still has control of sex in this way, especially of people who go to space, who stand to do the most discovery and whatnot. So that's a form of control that it exerts on its people. So maybe just swing the lever of control into a different direction. And again, maybe that's a reflection of modern times, how the government seeks to, even though it's sort of more freeing, the government still seeks to control through laws, through policy, through what standards and what norms it inflicts on the world. Because the government doesn't necessarily police heterosexuality, but it does police gay pride parades and all sorts of things like that. So and that's obviously because sometimes wild fascist lunatics might try to attack that, but it is the police sort of saying, hey, we're here and we could stop this at any sort of time. That's the government saying that as well. So this is not necessarily dystopia or what the future will bring. This is Delany sort of acknowledging what the modern sort of expectations are, what's going on in the 60s, and sort of expanding on that towards the future and what could develop as a result of that. And again, it's important to consider Delany's perspective as a gay man, what he was seeing in society, how gay men or even women were castrated or sterilized in some sort of way, fetishized in some sort of way, especially by those in power, and forced into maybe prostitution or something like that, and had their opportunities taken away from them. Kind of forced into a box, much like these spacers are forced into a box and seen as an oddity rather than just a facet of how this new society is. So you can see the vague amounts of fascism and control over its people, and how Delany as a gay man is sort of talking about his worries about what society can become if it sort of treats people this way. This is as much a critique on homophobia, transphobia, more so than merely a science fiction story with nothing else to it. Anyway, those are my thoughts on I and Gomorrah by Samuel R. Delany. Very fascinating short story, very complex short story, a lot to it. And I don't think I've even scratched the surface. As a heterosexual man, I probably don't think I can cover everything here as best as I could, because there's probably much more layered underneath the story, and it's probably also necessary for me to read other Samuel Delany stories in order to get a good understanding of what exactly he's tried to say as it pertains to sexuality, gender, the gay identity, and probably much more than that. So if you have any thoughts on this, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you and possibly have a discussion about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this story or this author if they don't already know. Also join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about such things or other forms of media. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and space travel-y travels. Farewell.